In this training, I want to explore how we can use assessment to synchronize teaching and learning. But first, I want us to reflect. Assessment is a tool, but whose tool is it? Is it a tool for the teacher, or is it a tool for the students? Perhaps it's a tool for the school. I think most of us would agree that assessment is a tool that benefits the teacher, that benefits the learner, and benefits the school. In fact, a tool that benefits all stakeholders. However, quite often, the way in which we conduct assessment, and more importantly, the way in which we respond to assessment, means that the benefit of assessment isn't equitably distributed across all stakeholders, and the potential to affect learning through assessment isn't quite achieved. And so, in order to get our brain working and in the right space, I want to ask a key question. When should we be assessing our students' learning? Well, it's a bit of a trick question, isn't it? Because if we truly believe in the potential of assessment to transform learning potential, then the real question should be not when should we be assessing student learning, but when shouldn't we be assessing student learning? Now, there are two main forms of assessment: summative assessment and formative assessment. And I wanted to look at these and explore these and compare these in this section. So, summative assessment, what is it? Well, it occurs at the end of the lesson, whereas formative assessment occurs during the learning activities. Summative assessment's aim is to audit or evaluate student attainment, whereas the aim of formative assessment is to monitor and address student learning. Summative assessment provides specific scores or results, whereas formative assessment provides students with feedback that moves learning forward. Summative assessment is perceived by both learner and teacher as high-stake form of assessment, whereas formative assessment is perceived by both the learner and the teacher as a low-stakes form of assessment. Now, I want you to reflect on your own practice. And probably it doesn't fit neatly within either one of those two boxes. It's probably not entirely summative and it's probably not entirely formative. But which is the best fit? Does your use of assessment fall more into the summative, or do you think it falls more into the formative? When thinking about the difference between these two approaches, I think Douglas Reeves expressed it very well. It's the difference between getting a medical or a post-mortem. And what do we want for our students? Do we want them to be receiving a post-mortem, or do we want them to be receiving a medical with the guidance they need in order to develop their learning? So the purpose of formative assessment is to synchronize teaching and learning so that the learner and the teacher can work together in real time to ensure that the student is achieving their full potential. It's about creating a much more responsive learning environment. Studies show that a staggering 70% of what teachers teach, students already know. Well, by engineering much more visible learning and assessment opportunities, we can ensure that we teach to the individual needs of the students, of the learners. So if Hamza has mastered it, then he can move on. Or he can teach Cameron, who we're aware hasn't. So learning becomes so much more efficient, and students spend more time in what Vygotsky described as the zone of proximal development. They're not sat in an area where the learner cannot do. They're not sat in that easy area that lacks challenge, where the learner can do it unaided. But they stay in that area of maximum potential for learning, that zone of proximal development. So with formative assessment, we are creating a much more responsive learning culture and a much more equitable learning culture. where we can direct our attention, our teaching, and our resources to where they're really needed, either to those students who can't do it unaided, or those students who are ready for even more challenge and need that expert standing by to offer them the problems they need to accelerate and challenge their learning. When we synchronize our teaching and our learning, it allows us to share and generate a very similar understanding in our students. And this can really accelerate and increase the power of learning. So, as a teacher, what's the potential of formative assessment? Well, it allows us to understand what the student understands. And it allows the student in turn to a better understanding of what they themselves understand. It allows the teacher a better understanding of the efficacy of their teaching approaches. And in turn, it allows the students a greater understanding of the efficacy of their learning approaches and processes. As teachers, it allows us to understand what adaptations need to take place in your teaching or the provision of learning experiences. In turn, students have a greater understanding of what actions to take to achieve their target or goal. As teachers, lastly, we gain a better understanding of how the student needs to develop as a learner. And in turn, the student gains a greater understanding of themselves as learners, their strengths, and their areas for development. We make assessments all the time, and far too often those assessments serve one key purpose: to audit what the student can and can't do. And of course, this is essentially the most important purpose of assessment, but not if it just stops there. If it becomes record keeping, like on Classroom Monitor, for example. The power of assessment and formative assessment has been proven in study after study after study to be the most powerful tool in transforming teaching and learning potential in students. The key is that it is a springboard, a catalyst for further action. The more we assess, the more we make learning visible in our lessons, the more opportunities we have to respond and make our learning much more equitable and deliver learning based on need. Effective formative assessment isn't just something we can sprinkle on a lesson. It's something that we have to consciously plan for. And the first and most important part of this is learning must be targeted. Students must have a clear idea of what we want them to achieve and how they will be successful in that learning. So a clear learning objective and a coherent success criteria are essential. When we're writing that learning objective, and this must be the starting point at the planning of any lesson, it should be focused on understanding. Too often, our learning objectives and our lessons are focused on what we want the students to know or do. But actually, we need to focus much more on what we want them to understand in the lesson. Our learning objectives should be concept-based, so students understand that what they're learning, they can apply in other contexts as well. So, if we're learning in this lesson to create imagery with our writing in order to write an opening for a fairy tale, the fact that we're doing it for an opening for a fairy tale is neither here nor there. What we're learning to do is create imagery with our writing. And that concept can be applied in all different places, all different types of writing. And of course, a cohesive success criteria that builds and gives them the steps they need in order to be successful. The next thing that's really important is that we don't plan lesson by lesson, that we plan units, not lesson, that we plan for opportunities to make learning visible, greater focus on understanding. When learning is visible, it's very accessible, But what activities can you plan into your lessons and your units to ensure that learning is really visible? And planning for opportunities to apply feedback. Of course, while we want people to be making assessments throughout lessons and responding to that in real time, there will be times when we give feedback at the end of the lesson, and it's really important that this feedback can be acted upon and integrated in the next lesson. When we think about assessment, we tend to think about final learning outcomes or work. We tend to think about tests and assessments. We tend to think about questioning. But of course, there are lots of ways to make learning visible. Well, let's start with questioning. And the key to questioning is open questions, not closed questions, and questions that require higher order thinking. But simply by asking a critical question, we won't necessarily engage the student in higher order thinking or critical thinking, because that requires quite a complex process. To think critically, students have to engage in a higher order thinking. They have to have analysed, they have to have evaluated, and so they can give a reasoned judgment based on that analysis and evaluation. So we need to use scaffolded questioning in order to support them to analyse and then to evaluate that analysis. And then we can ask the critical question that requires them to give the reasoned judgment based on that analysis and evaluation. We can fall into the trap of thinking that critical thinking is about answering how and why questions. And not all how and why questions require critical thinking. But asking a question like, well, what do you think? Or could you do this? Or should we do this? These often have very critical responses. One really key thing is random selection. No hands raised in class. When we ask students to put up their hands in order to answer a question, or when we allow students to put up their hands when we ask a question, we divide the room into two factors. Those who are confident that they know the answer and those who we're unsure about. There are lots of reasons why students may not put up their hands, and it's not always because they're not confident that they know the answer. Sometimes they just simply don't want to share in that forum. Now, there's lots of research to show that in America, and this barely seems relevant, but I'll bring it back at the end. In America, studies show that students born in January, February, or March are twice as likely to become professional ice hockey players. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is because the ice hockey season starts in January. The clubs open in January, and you have to be 9 years old to join. And so, as soon as the boys or the girls reach 9 years old, they're able to join the club. And they get more training, they get more exposure and practice. And because the other students are joining later, they're older than the students who are joining. And so they're taller and stronger. And so they get a lot more practice, a lot more exposure, and a lot more training. And hence, they become much more adept, much better ice hockey players. And the same thing happens to those students who have the aptitude and the inclination to raise their hands. Because they raise their hands all the time, they get much more interaction with you and their learning is accelerated. What we need to do is create a culture in the classroom where it doesn't matter whether you raise your hand or not, you're going to have to respond to the questions. And it doesn't matter if we don't know the answer. Sometimes a child might say, I don't know the answer. And a good question and a good response to that is, well, what would your answer be if you thought you did know the answer? We've got to make children understand that we're going to come back to them. So you can simply say, well, let me come back to you. Let's hear some other responses, and you tell me which one you agree with most. Other exercises we can do are sorting and ordering exercises. These are really good to get the students to engage with the topic and think critically about it and engage in the higher order thinking. Visible thinking routines. Excellent way for us to see exactly what the student understands exactly where they're coming from and exactly what their learning potential is. Analysis and evaluation of other people's examples. As often as possible, we need to take the student's ego out of the learning. Ego can be quite damaging, and so it's much easier for a student to evaluate and analyse another child's piece of work. And so, of course, we've got our modelled example up on the board, but actually, before we get the students to really analyse and evaluate their own work, they should practice on other students' work. And it's a good idea to keep samples of work from the previous year. Live whiteboards. We've already mentioned that some students just don't like shouting out answers in front of the rest of the class. And so live whiteboards are a really good idea, or whiteboards. So as a blended learning device, so that they can stream straight to your iPad or your computer and you can see exactly what they're able to do in the moment. And that will allow you to intervene where necessary and to peel away students who don't need further input. And this is a hugely important part of formative assessment, that we don't keep students and lecture them when we don't need to. If they understand something, they can go and move on to something else. Oh, something that's rather interesting and I thought worth mentioning is a traffic light system. And you can do that with live whiteboards, you can do it with cups on the table, and that students have understanding that green means they're really confident, amber means they're a bit tricky, they need a bit more input, red means they can't do this, they're stuck and they have a question. You could do this by changing the background on the live whiteboards and they can communicate that feeling with you, or just by putting a coloured dot in the corner to show where they are. Now, the thing that works really well with this is if a student shows red and has a question, it's up to another student who is showing green to answer it. And this really evolves the classroom culture, that it's okay to ask questions and get stuck. But there's a responsibility on the rest of the class in order to support them through that. We learn sociably, and so debates are a really good way for students to show their learning and to deepen their understanding as well. We need to move away from the idea of work and instead engineer learning experiences. And of course, assessment is only as important as the feedback that's given. Feedback is hugely important. And there are some key things to remember. Feedback should never come in the form of grading. And I'm pleased to say this is not something we do overtly in school, but there are subtler ways that we can give an indication of grading. When we grade something, what we find is that students aren't interested in what they need to do to improve. They're just interested in the grade they've acquired, whether it's good or whether it's bad. If it's good, they think, right, well, I don't need to develop this anymore. If it's bad, well, they're not motivated to develop it anymore, and it creates a sense of low self-efficacy. When we share a grade with a student, the first thing they do is they look at the grade. What do you think the second step is? It's not looking at a comment to see how they can improve. It's looking to see what somebody else's grade is. By grading students, what we do is we get them to evaluate themselves as a learner against other students, comparing themselves to other students. And this is really damaging to learning potential. Feedback should always move the learning forward. Remember what we said before, it shouldn't be an autopsy concerned with what went wrong. It should be a medical concerned with what they have to do to improve. Verbal or written. I'm pleased to say that we're now as a school giving a lot more verbal feedback and a lot less written feedback. One-to-one verbal feedback is the most superior form of feedback. It's a good idea to try and keep a record of the feedback that you've given. And group and individual. So that one-to-one is the superior form of feedback. The feedback should be focused on the LO and success criteria. That's the contract that you've entered into. This is what we're learning, and this is how we'll be successful. And it should be focused on process and performance, not praise. I know it's very, very tempting to praise our students. Oh, you're so clever. This is wonderful. But when we do that, what the research shows is this actually restricts the potential of the student's learning. It creates a fixed mindset. Students become less inclined to drive their own learning forward, less inclined to take risks with their learning, less inclined to pursue challenge if we give them overt praise in our feedback. What we need to do is we need to focus on the process and performance. Feedback should require more engagement and effort from the student than the teacher. There's a cartoon and it says, school is a place where students go to watch teachers work. And actually, it's quite true, isn't it? Think about the amount of effort that goes into, and a word we don't hear very often anymore, thank goodness, marking books, writing comments, so much effort. And for what? It's a bit of an autopsy so often. We're asking the child to look back at something that in their mind is done. So, how can you make that more meaningful? Okay, I'm going to give you 3 pieces of feedback. One of these relates to you. Which one? Okay, I'm not going to tell you I've made a dot by each of these points in your work. I wonder if you can work out what the mistake was and what I want you to change. It's really important that the feedback is more cognitively engaging for the student than the teacher. It's really important that the feedback be followed up with and that there are opportunities for them then to apply it and integrate it into their learning. And a key thing about feedback is, I mentioned this before, we need to take the ego out of learning. Ego is a hugely damaging thing to learning. And so when we write our feedback, it needs to engage the student cognitively, not emotionally. And when we give feedback, it's really important that it's prioritized. It's really important that we don't give the students too much to think about. I mean, we understand this as teachers. There are so many priorities, it's impossible for us to address them all. Well, it's the same for students. What's the one thing they can do to really improve their writing? What's the one thing they can do to really improve their scientific inquiry, their investigation? What's the one thing they could have done in order to get better at solving these maths problems? It's really important that we focus them on a key thing, because when learning is targeted, it can be so much more effective. Now, we can use formative assessment in an instruction-based classroom. So the teacher can stand at the front still if they want and pepper their instruction with questions and have visible thinking routines on the board as they teach. But if you really want to synchronize your teaching and learning, if you really want to transform your classroom so that your teaching is responsive to the learning needs of the students, we need to move away from this structure of instruction from the teacher and then work from the students. We need to create visible learning experiences throughout the lesson where students are constantly engaged with learning, not work. There are times when there needs to be a learning outcome, maybe even a comic strip to show what they know. But actually, if we divide the lesson up this way, too much of the lesson isn't concerned with learning. Less than half the lesson is concerned with learning. The rest of the lesson is concerned with proving that they've learnt it, or at best rehearsal. So, let's give more time to the learning and create visible learning experiences throughout the lesson and assess them formatively. Direct our teaching where it's needed, direct our resources where it's needed in the students.